outcomes part of the TEF assessment. Now, it's important to say that it isn't particularly the case that these were amazingly insightful institutions because they were gold on outcomes, because sometimes most of that decision about the gold for outcomes was based on those metrics around completion, well, continuation, completion, and progression, and obviously those were an important part of that award of gold. But the discussion around educational gains was very rich, really, across all of the submissions, and I had to sample the submissions in some way or other. So sampling the 51 that had the gold seemed to be a good idea, in the sense that presumably most of these providers had something interesting to say about educational gains. So what I undertook was this thematic analysis of references to educational gains in the TEF submissions, and as I say, that's written up as an OFS report. So if we go to the next slide, so a bit of context. Thank you. So you may not know, or you may know, why it is that educational gains suddenly appeared as a concept in TEF 2024 when it wasn't in previous TEF rounds. And you'll recall that Dame Shirley Pearce undertook a review of the TEF, and what she recommended in her review was that TEF asks for evidence determined by the providers that addresses what our students gain from our educational experience and how we evidence that. And that turned into the OFS TEF guidelines in their OFS Regulatory Advice 22, which is what was referred to by the panels as RA 22 in shorthand. Was that in those guidelines, the OFS were asking for a higher education provider's own articulation of the gains it intends its students to achieve. So the exam question wasn't, what is the proper definition of educational gains? The exam question was, how would you articulate the gains your students are designed to achieve? And the more I looked into this, the more rational this seemed, because of course you've got so much diversity in the higher education sector. And then the second point the OFS was asking for, what's the provider's approach to supporting these educational gains, which I'll touch on briefly today, but in many ways that aspect of it is more developed. And then thirdly, any evidence, that interesting use of language, any evidence of the gains achieved by the provider's students. So there's very much an admission in the guidelines for TEF that providers at a very early stage in this sort of somewhat new concept of really thinking about educational gains. Of course, it varies a lot across the sector, the extent to which that's so. But that very final subsection of the outcomes part of the TEF was saying, do you have any evidence of the gains, of how you have actually measured gains? And that was a much more open and sometimes undeveloped section in many of the providers' submissions, and that was fine, because that was kind of what was expected. And in fact, the panels themselves were told not to pay too much attention to that final bit about evidence of gains, because it was kind of not expected that the providers would be too far down that road. Although, as we'll see, some of them are much further down that road than others. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to go straight into the findings. It's a relatively short time I have today, but obviously if you want to look in more detail, lots of quotations from the different providers on how they're describing things, then you can go directly to the OFS report. But so the first point I wanted to clearly make in the report was that educational gains are values based, and many of the providers, when they talk about their vision, the provider vision and mission, and they talk about the underpinning values, will say this is where our notion of educational gains comes from. It's to do with the values that we have, the commitment to social justice, the commitment to wide, opportunity for all, whatever it might be. And so the relationship between the values-based mission for a particular institution, and as I say, they're so varied, and the kind of range of values expressed as underpinning that mission, and the educational gains that are being articulated seem to be a very important set of connections. And then Secondly, the articulations of educational gains can include, and did include, or were somewhat limited to in some cases, a set of core graduate skills and attributes. And understandably, I'll say a little bit more about this in a moment, many providers, especially comprehensive providers, focused on this idea of what are the core graduate skills? Have we got a graduate attribute scheme? Let's talk about those and talk about how we might be developing those and how we might know whether students have actually reached that range of that schema, if you like, of skills and attributes. And that's a part of it. But there are important points to be made here around the fact that you can't ever write in stone a set of graduate skills and attributes and expect them to last over time. And I think a number of providers made that point. Remember Imperial College being one, making the point that if you're looking for any particular set of things to measure, then that must remain dynamic, because over time, those skills and attributes that you're looking for are always going to be moving forward. And then third point on this slide, and one that I wanted to make, I felt, I suppose, drawing on my own educational background, I wanted to make fairly strongly, and I think is valid and kind of interesting for this notion of educational gains, is that educational gains are broader than learning gains. So a lot of the work in the sector around learning gain that's happened, which I make some reference to, and I'm sure you will have heard about if you were on the call. I wasn't on the call, unfortunately, but for yesterday with Camille talking about her great work for the QAA around these sorts of things, and she's done lots of analysis as well in the past around learning gains. If you're on the call, Camille, do come in later, and put me right, and add your wisdom. But it seems to me that the use of language in the TEF of educational gains was really useful, and actually that was drawing on the Shirley Pearce's report, where she says, what are the educational gains overall that students are gaining? Now, obviously, you might say the vast majority of those gains are going to be learning gains, the things that you now know, understand, and can do that you didn't know, understand, and can do before, and the kind of affective or emotional and values-based kind of dimensions of that, in the sense that you've changed as a person. But, and I think this is important, a number of providers said that the educational gains go beyond learning gains. So building new networks, experiencing particular types of opportunities, careers-related advice and connections that are made. Those are not strictly learning. I mean, obviously there's learning involved in everything, but they're not strictly learning gains, but they are educational gains. And so I think answering that broader question, as a result of your education with us during the time that you spent with us in this provider, what did you gain? And I think that asks a bigger question than specifically how to measure points of learning, which remain very important, but shouldn't really subsume the whole space, I would say, around educational gains. So if we go to the next slide. What I noticed, and obviously you can kind of divide up all kinds of things, but by different types of analysis. But what was clear when I looked again and again at these different providers' submissions was that when providers were talking about educational gains, they were talking about some different sorts of things, and sometimes they would kind of mix them up, and sometimes they would just be talking about one of them. So I identified these three different types, if you like, of comprehensive gains, and that would come under the category of we are looking for graduate attributes in every single one of our graduates, and these include this and that and the other, and it doesn't matter what degree you do, but it's a comprehensive aim that we have, that there will be this group of gains that will be shared by everybody. Then, slightly differently from this, their identification of targeted gains. So the Open University, for example, talk particularly about the nature of their students. You know, I taught with the Open University, and it's right that you're dealing with a different range of types of students, maybe mature students, students that are working and, you know, studying at a distance and so on. So what are the specific targeted gains that you're looking to achieve for these students in this particular boat? And obviously there are all sorts of other subgroups or, you know, specific groups, if you like, demographic groups as well, including first in the family and in university. Oh, that looks like it's Camille arriving. That's great. And so there's the comprehensive gains. You know, all students in our institution should gain these. The targeted gains, we're targeting these at all of our students because they're in a particular demographic group, or we're targeting them differently at different groups within our institution. Incidentally, of course, targeted gains conceptually would include all of the intended learning outcomes for a given programme. Because if you're signed up to do, you know, medicine or a land-based degree or something, then, oh, just getting some sound from somebody. Great. And if sorry, slightly lost my thread there for a moment. Yeah, so targeted gains would include those intended learning outcomes for different programs of study, because clearly you're expecting students to learn something different if they're studying medicine than if they're studying, you know, literature or whatever. But more broadly than the program-based gains, there are other sorts of targeted gains that go with these particular demographic groups, and there are different examples within the report. And then thirdly, personalised, or you might describe these as tailored. I think I used the word tailored actually in the report. And these are gains that are explicitly curated for individual students. So in some institutions, not all, some institutions, you know, they can provide an more individualised kind of personal tutorial system that really looks at what an individual student's needs, and maybe with the help of a plan and you know, a journal or a log or some sort of way of developing those at a personalised level. And I suppose in some ways that would be the holy grail, if, you know, if resource was no object for everybody, to really personalise those educational gains. But what I found in the TEF submissions was that institutions were sometimes talking about one or more of these and not necessarily explaining clearly that these were somewhat different sorts of things. But of course, as I said, they're not mutually exclusive. So important, as I say, and this is a kind of preliminary to saying, if you're going to measure educational gains, or purport to, then it's absolutely vital to understand what it is you're actually identifying as being the gains. And as I say, we'll come back to that in a moment. And then secondly, on this slide, that clearly the knowledge, skills and attributes that students develop through their core programs of study are always going to remain central. And in some ways it's a sleight of hand, this thing, talking about educational gains through the TEF, because in part one of the TEF, which is all about student experience, which is about student education, clearly things are being said about this is the quality of our education and our assessment, and this is how we know students are gaining, you know, important aspects of their learning. But when institutions was talking about educational gains, they were sort of mentioning that and then sort of dismissing it and going on and talking about the other stuff, which you can understand why they were doing, given the shortage of space and time within a 25-page submission. But important to say, I think, that within the and it was certainly important for the providers to say that within the programmes of study, that disciplinary and interdisciplinary gains, which of course also can go beyond the curriculum itself, were important, and those were emphasised in different ways by different providers. So if we go on to the next slide. I'll be fairly brief about this because it will all be very familiar to you. But curriculum design, approaches to teaching and use of resources are all of central importance, and providers do emphasise how important these are to ensuring that students are being are enabled to have these transformative experiences. And as I mentioned earlier, co-curricular and extracurricular activities really important. So you've got this whole range of co-curricular and extracurricular activities going on at different institutions. Depending on the type and size of the institutions, these can vary in scope and type very specifically. But students do very often have a rich menu of opportunities to extend their educational gains beyond their taught programmes. But important to note in this final point on this slide, that as we all know, again, that students and particular groups of students are very differently situated with their respective opportunities to achieve these wider gains. And obviously there can be financial barriers, there can be logistical barriers for students, maybe commuting students or whatever, lots of different reasons why students are differently situated. So if we go on to the next slide. So talking about measuring gains, it's really important, given everything we've said about how gains can be differently configured, that it only makes sense to say, can we measure educational gains, when you first say, what are the educational gains we have or that we're looking for that we want to set about to measure? The complexity of a hugely diverse higher education sector, enormous numbers of different subjects, enormous numbers of different approaches to teaching and assessment, hugely variable backgrounds of students coming into different institutions, and very different ways of saying or deciding upon what these gains are that we actually want to measure, means, as far as I'm concerned, and clearly was the case as far as providers were concerned in most cases, that there was no way, there's no rational way of, and I'd be fascinated if any of you would like to pick me up on this and disagree with me, because I'm very happy to have this discussion. But in all logical ways, I would argue that there is no feasible way of measuring every single gain made by every single student in every single context. It's just not practically feasible to do it, because the gains that students actually make are always more and different from the ones that you set about, even when you've got your intended learning outcomes, or you've got your graduate attributes, or you've got these particular set of things that you want to measure. So what can you do then in terms of measuring gains? And just hold that thought. I'm coming to the end of my sort of my talk here, and it'll be really interesting to hear you come back with some questions. But a really important point here, and I obviously do make in the report, is that particularly where people have drawn on the notion of learning gains in the literature, and for particular types of provider, what's been really important in thinking about educational gains is what is sometimes called distance travelled by students. So some providers, particularly those which perhaps don't have very large numbers of international students, and those which have a relatively sort of steady set of entry qualifications, say, well, what we've done is we've looked at the distance travelled by students coming in with particular types of qualifications, and then looking at their degree outcomes, and we're doing some measures around that. And in a particular context, that can be perfectly valid. But there are some institutions, and University of Cambridge as an example in the report, who say, we can't possibly do that because the entry requirements for our students coming in are incredibly similar, and they're all within a very narrow range. And so you get all of these students coming in with a very narrow range of entry requirements, including a lot of international students whose entry requirements is very hard to find precise equivalences within any case. And of course, degree outcomes are very broad brush degree outcomes. These, if we had grade point averages or something, it might be more feasible to do this sort of thing. So again, I would argue that the idea of doing a kind of value added, or well, a distance travelled, to be more specific, measure for students coming into their degrees and going out of their degrees using qualification, entry and exit qualifications, is incredibly complex and fraught with challenges. And again, I just don't think that makes any sense. But what you can do is, or any provider can do, is set up a series of proxy measures of some kind, which will give us a picture, and perhaps a longitudinal picture, of what's happening with certain sorts of gains. If we go to the next slide. Just a thought, just while you're holding that thought, about who can measure the gains, who's actually going to measure the educational gains. And so there's obviously a role for student. Obviously, we know that staff will be assessing learning outcomes and so on, and can have a role in assessing wider gains once they're articulated, and some sort of measurement is set up for those. But students can have a role in articulating and curating and tracking their own educational gains, and of course stakeholders and employers and representatives and so on can help to measure educational gains as well. And there are some examples of that in the report. And so if you go into the next slide, almost at the end, just summarising then ways in which gains, as I saw it, in terms of, and remember what I'm limited to in this report is the submissions by providers for TEF last year. But looking at the different ways in which gains can be measured. So you can obviously, what we're all doing is assessing learning outcomes that are part of a programme of study, or for the programme of study. That's a sort of given, that's a kind of core of learning gains at the centre of things. What you can also do is assess, for example, through self-assessment, but there are other ways as well, educational gains achieved beyond the programme of study. You can get students to create artifacts of some kind that express what kinds of educational gains they've achieved beyond the programme of study, should you have a design or in a context in which that makes sense. And as I say, probably not for all contexts. A quick plug for something that I've been recommending for quite a few years. Some of you will be familiar with my work on connected curriculum, and there's a connection here. So I talk in that book around the idea of a showcase portfolio, a kind of holistic, synoptic kind of portfolio that students can produce, and there are examples of this happening in the sector at the culmination of their studies during the time with the provider, and that can be a way of students pulling together the gains and demonstrating gains that they've made, which can go beyond learning gains to those wider educational gains. Then, of course, you can develop specific schemes to assess an agreed selection of graduate attributes. That's perfectly possible as well. And you can, as mentioned earlier, you can design proxies for the distance travelled where this is feasible, given the entry qualifications or initial assessments. And then what I didn't put on this slide, but kind of, as an important part of this, what a number of providers have actually done is created a kind of set of key performance indicators, or one provider I think referred to as an educational gains index, by saying we are going to put together a basket of measures, and it's going to include these particular learning outcomes, which are core to all of our programs. It's going to include these particular questions on the NSS, an additional bank of NSS questions. It's going to include this, it's going to include that. And we're going to put that together and make a kind of educational gains index, and that's going to be used as our sort of proxy for measuring educational gains. And I think that might be the last slide. Rosie, I should know this, shouldn't I? Yes, my concluding thoughts. So my concluding thoughts in the report are that there is no single sector-wide approach to defining and measuring educational gains, and either proposed by the TEF or by the providers. And I'm fascinated to know whether Camille's work has led us towards something further that might come closer to a kind of agreed sector-wide way of actually doing this. But notwithstanding the fact that this certainly was not the case, that there was no shared one-size-fits-all notion of educational gains through the TEF exercise, what I think was important was that articulating these wider gains and really exploring them was an important sort of corollary really to the sort of let's just stick to the metrics and how many students went on to graduate level jobs, etc., because that doesn't tell the whole story at all. Talking about educational gains in a more qualitative way, in a richer and deeper way, tells a much better story as far as I'm concerned, I suppose, of coming as a qualitative researcher to you. A much richer way of actually thinking about what educational gains are. And as I say, in particular contexts, you can say, we are, for the purposes of our needs at the moment, we are going to look at these particular educational gains and we're going to measure them in these ways. But as I say, articulating gains reflects the benefits to the students that are deeper and wider than qualifications, graduate employment, and the other sorts of metrics that TEF focuses on. And I think this is especially so where the notion of educational gains becomes core to a dialogue between the students, between other stakeholders, and obviously staff of all kinds in all roles in our higher education institutions, that really can get together as part of a sort of creative, values-based opportunity to say, what is it we're doing here? And how can we make sure that students have the richest possible set of outcomes in their fullest sense during their time with us? And how can we assure ourselves year on year that they are achieving what they want, what we want, but most importantly, what they want, of course, and what employers and others need as a result of what we're actually providing. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to you coming back with some questions later.